Directs various research projects and exhibitions. He's also an adjunct lecturer in Brown University's Department of Anthropology, so he teaches on museum studies there, for example. Previously, he's also served as an associate curator and head of anthropology division at the Buffalo Museum of Science. So Kevin's interests really lie in sort of complex societies, state formation, law, human ecology. He's published widely on these issues, and he's working in a very interdisciplinary fashion as well, which is why we thought he would be such a perfect keynote speaker for this conference. So I'm not going to dwell on this any longer, I'm just going to give the floor to Kevin, and you can please start.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First off, this may be one of the last times all of us are together when we aren't eating and drinking, and I just wanted to say many thanks to Alex Sandmark and to Anna Passo and to all of the organizers for a wonderful conference, and hope that you'll all join me in a round of applause for them. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the front? Okay, good. I'll try to hold on to this. I also want to thank a lot of the people whose talks I've heard here, Ksheta Katona and Marian Polovez, in particular Alex and Anne-Marie Riso. I've been surprised how many things there are having to do with outlaws and with ritual and with law here, all of which are things that have my mind bubbling all over. So I'll try and keep things to the time limit, and we'll see where we go. Now, my apologies to anyone who came expecting with the title to hear a concert by Iceland's most successful contemporary indie band of monsters and men. My 13-year-old daughter, back here, Emily Smith, she gave me the hook for this paper's title, since I'll be exploring two different possible explanations. For a small but fascinating site in the interior of Iceland, which is called Surtshellir, not Surtshellir, but it's okay if you want to go there, where I've been working on and off for about 15 years. Now, let's see if we get this thing working. When Alex asked me to come and do a talk for you, she gave me three themes: inhabiting the north, maps and mapping, or landscapes. I'm not going to talk about maps and mapping, except maybe touching tangentially on the idea of cognitive maps that people had at some point, but talking about inhabiting the north, how people moved into Iceland and dealt with at least one very unexpected phenomenon that hit them right away. And then landscapes, this idea of physical landscapes, literary, mythical, all of which connect to Surtshellir, and also the ways in which this as a monument was thought about and reused over the span of about 1,000 years. So is there a pointer on this, or we just...
It won't work because it's a screen on the front.
Perfect, okay. So just to give you a basic sense, the wheres, the whys, the hows of Iceland, probably everyone knows, settled in and around 870 AD. Reykjavik down here, Reykholt, which I'll mention, which was,
it was a touch screen, yes.
Which is Snorri Sturluson's home, who wrote most of what we know about Surtur, and put down a lot of things in the Prose Edda, a lot of information from him. And Surtshellir itself is up here at an elevation of about 600 meters above sea level, just on the edge of Iceland's interior desert and just below a series of large glaciers. Now, that's the large-scale picture. The small-scale picture is to sort of hook you in, is to say we're going to get into this place fairly heavily, which is one of the best preserved Viking Age structures in the world, standing as it was made 1,000 years ago, about 7 to 10 meters below the surface of the Earth, and about 250 meters back into the longest lava cave in the Icelandic interior. That was enough to hook me. But what really hooked me is that I was doing work in Iceland in 2000 on a Viking Age iron production site, and had a lot of tourists come up to me and say, "You're working way too hard. We just went up on a bus tour up into the interior on this newly built road to this cave with a bunch of stack of Viking Age bones, and we took out bags of them for our friends." And I talked to my friends at the National Museum of Iceland. I said, "Oh my God, is this site mapped? What's known about it?" So everyone knows it's the old lava cave up in the interiors where the outlaws lived. Has it ever been explored? Has it ever been mapped? No. Has it ever been excavated? No. Has it ever been surveyed? No. I said, this has got to be a problem. So I was going off to a project in England in 2001, and arranged with my friend Guðmundur Ólafsson at the National Museum of Iceland to go in and do a very quick mapping project. I took off on a plane about a week after 9/11, one of the first flights out of New York for Iceland, and we went down inside the cave, and that apocalyptic aspect keeps coming back again and again and again to some degree. And this is when we walked a generator across a lava field, which I never suggest you do. A gasoline generator is really heavy, and ran power cords down inside the cave and flipped them on. This is what I was standing in. I've been in once before, and in the dark, you couldn't really see what it was. So we'll get to that. Now, why did the Icelanders go into this cave and do this? I think you have to start a little bit before that and look at the interior of Iceland. Again, here's where we are. This is Langjökull Glacier. And the orange dots represent a series of sites. These are the sites at Landnámabók. The farmsteads at Landnámabók talks about being settled in the first 2 generations of Iceland settlement. That may or may not be correct, but we know, for example, at Gilsbaki there are deposits that go back right to the beginning. Whoops, let's go backwards. At Hals here, we've got iron production sites, Reykholt, so we know that there is settlement high up into the valley at this point. Just as people were settling here and the farms are all sitting over top of the 871 plus or minus 2 volcanic tephra layer. This is this wonderful bichromatic ash layer that covers most of Iceland, and all but 2 sites are right on top of it. What also flowed on top of it, happened right on top of it, is that a fissure opened up in the interior of Langjökull, split the glacier. All of the area in red was inundated in lava. 242 square kilometers of lava, one of the largest lava flows in Icelandic history since the time of settlement, and also quite likely one of the first volcanic eruptions that Northern Europeans had ever seen or experienced. It flowed down into the interior of this settlement zone here, and according to some of the people who study place names and geology in this area, it probably flowed over 6 farms that had been established right at the time of settlement, whose names are recorded in Landnámabók and never again thereafter. And you can begin to track out where those were, and also place names. And they suggest that those were probably down here in the heel and up here along that zone there. So a massive lava flow. Now we're really lucky that in the past year and a half, we've had a major lava eruption of the same sort, the Hollafroin eruption in the center of Iceland. And this is from 2015. Actually, as the lava was flowing down out of that thing, this lava pile is about 7.5 meters high. And this covered about 80 square kilometers, and it took about 9 months to do so. So when we think about the Hofmundarhraun eruption, the one that covered this area and created Surtshellir, we don't know how long it took to erupt, but it was probably at least 2 years. It could have been 5 years. Some of the geologists say it could have been a 15-year-long eruption. So if you can imagine, even for a year, 2 years, 3 years, up on the horizon beyond you, when you've come from a place like Norway, when you've come from places like Orkney, which are tectonically stable, to see nothing but smoke and fire on the horizon, and this tongue of flame coming down, periodically hitting dams, bursting out the front with tongues of lava like this, it had to have scared, pardon the expression, scared the shit out of people as they were coming in there, scared the bejesus out of them. A very strange thing to think about. And this lava as it's flowing is about 1,250 to 1,500 degrees centigrade. So we're talking serious things. And it's covering 242 square kilometers of fertile upland grazing land. Now, for people who are transhuman pastoralists, that's a lot of land lost. And for people who may have thought about the world in the terms that Snorri Sturluson says when thinking about Ragnarok, or at the very end of the battle for the world, for creation, the last of the gods to die is Freyr, the god of agricultural fertility, who is killed by Surtur, the lord of Muspelheim, who is all about fire and flame. There must have been something very metaphorically evocative about this event that was going on. So the lava field is more than 50 kilometers long, covers 242 square kilometers. 25 caves are known in it. At least 8 of them have cultural remains. Surtshellir is the largest of them at 3.5 kilometers long for its paired cave, Stephensetlir. These are massive caves. We're talking ceilings between 12 and 15 meters high, and the tubes are equally 10 to 15 meters across. Think subway tunnels, and that's what you've got. Massive, massive things. Now, when we went there in 2001, we were really working on the basis of a salvage project and talking a lot to people and listening to the current stories about Surtshellir, which really had to do with outlaws. Everyone knew that Surtshellir was the outlaw cave. And we wrote about it and we published it. I'm so sorry about that, but it is an important piece for it. I worried a lot about that in the years afterwards because there were things that I know from working in caves and being in caves for a long time that are very important that we'll get into about what you have to do to live in a cave. And although we were only there for 2 or 3 days, in the years afterwards I began to worry about it and wondered and thought and went back to the sources as well to see what did they say about it. Where was the first reference to Surtshellir? Well, the earliest reference to Surtshellir isn't at all about outlaws. It is in Landnámabók, and it's the first time that the cave is mentioned by name, Surtshellir, the cave of Surtur. And in Landnámabók it says that a young man, a chieftain's son named Thorvaldur Holbarki, the hollow throat, perhaps meaning a chanter. It's hard to know what that name means. A chieftain's son from the north of Iceland makes a trip of 150 kilometers through the interior of Iceland to do nothing more than to proclaim a poem of praise, a draupa, to the giant who lived inside the cave. And then, when he has done this, in this very laconic piece, he goes down the valley to Thorvardstaðir, marries the girl who lives there, goes back and starts his own lineage, his own dynasty. There's nothing that is very straightforward about this. It's very much of a ritual act. It's very much of a kind of a hero's journey and a reconstruction of the social order, whether it had anything to do with the reality of Thorvald Holbarki, who claimed his descent all the way back to Odin, and who is said to have composed this 12-verse draupa to the giant inside the cave. So that right away made me think there's something different going on. There's nothing about outlaws in this. And Surtur, who he talks about, as Snorri had said, was the first to exist. The first world to exist was Muspelheim, and Surtur was the guardian of it. It is the fire of Muspelheim meeting the frost and the poison from the north that creates the world as we know it. So you might be able to say that Surtur is almost there at the beginning of creation before anything else. And he also says he has a flaming sword, and at the end of the world he will come and harry and will vanquish all the gods and burn the entire world with flame. And Surtur generally is believed to mean not only black, but the blackener, the scorcher, the destroyer. And of course in Ragnarok, I love these great pictures that the Dungeons and Dragons folks do. Thereupon you'll fling fire over the earth and burn the whole world up, and as I said at the end, the last of the gods is that he kills his Freyr, and there's a nice sort of parallelism there. So what about the outlaws? Where do we get the outlaws in Surtshellir? Landnámabók does talk about outlaws, and it does talk about them being in the Hálfmundarhund. It says that Thorhallur Oddsdóttir married Torfi, the son of Balbrand, and Torfi slew the men of Krop, and 12 of them altogether, and he also slaughtered Word in the Hálfmundarhund. And then at Hitlisfitjar, with Illugi the Black, another chieftain, and Sturla Godi, he killed 18 outlaws at a place called Hitlisfitjar. They don't say Surtshellir, although they've said Surtshellir elsewhere in Landnámabók. And we know there are many caves up there, and Hitlisfitjar is a fairly wide-ranging place name in that area, which means the plains beside the caves. So there's a tradition by the 13th century when Landnámabók is written, or the late 12th century, of outlaws being in the fields as well, but not necessarily in Surtshellir. And when you look at Landnám's book, the mobility of the people involved, these are the 3 chieftains, that's where the outlaws are said to have come from, a farm just down the way, and one of them from the home barrier area. Again, the sense of movement between, and this is a constant theme in the stories about Surtshellir. It's always a contest between forces of destruction, forces of inversion of the social order, and chieftains or local leaders overcoming them in a kind of an interesting folkloric way. The next time Surtshellir comes into any account is on July 20th, 1236, when Sturla Sigvatsson came down to Reykholt, grabbed his cousin, Snorri Sturluson's bastard son, in all the meanings of the word bastard, a real nasty guy, and bound him and dragged him up into Surt's cave and took him up onto the wall, it talks about, inside the cave. And there they bent a spear into a hook and used it to gouge out one of his eyes and to castrate him and to leave him to bleed to death in the dark, in the cave, thinking about his wife. Nasty cousin. You don't need that sort of family around. But there's interesting aspects of that also, because what they're doing in the marking, one could also say, is marking him in a way as an Odinic character, taking out one eye, castrating him. The gelded one is one of his names, the one who's been gouged with a spear. There's a series of that, and there's 3 generations in Snorri's family who wind up having connections, negative ones, that are described as having something to do with Odin. At any rate, it's a way that you would take a chieftain in a Christian period and completely trash him, take away his reputation. Unfortunately for them, like a good James Bond enemy, they had this elaborate plan. They left him to die alone, didn't realize that his kinsmen were out in the lava field. They took him out. He was really mad. Things got even worse. Iceland had 680 years of colonial dependency as a result. So this is important. The next time the cave really comes into anyone's discussion is in 1753, and that's a really important thing. There's a long gap where this cave is simply quiet. But when Egil Olafsson and Bjarni Pálsson, two of Iceland's first naturalists, go up into the cave, they have a number of things that they learn. They are told that there are several tales told of different bands of robbers who successfully resided in this cavern, which have made such an impression on the minds of the people that none of them will attempt to enter it. They're also told the story of Surtur, having been the denizen of this cave, but being good humanists of their time, they immediately say this is pure superstition and should be ignored. And then they're told that no one would go into the cave, and they were dissuaded from going into the cave because the peasants of the area make every possible attempt to deter them from entering the cave, insinuating that they would never return, as spirits never failed to punish the curious by killing them or preventing them from finding their way back. This is 700 years after the last, or 500 years after the last account of Surtshellir, and what I want you to get the sense of is that every time Surtshellir comes into discussion, it's about disaster, it's about dread, it's about terror, it's about fear. This is easily one of the most feared places in the Icelandic landscape. And it becomes then, with Bjarni Pálsson and Egil Olafsson, they begin to tame it. And they go in and they make the first map and they make the first discussion of the archaeological site inside the cave. And they make the first, you could say, the first excavation of the cave, because they say they demolished the top third of the bone pile that was there looking for weapons and dug around everywhere else. And they didn't find very much. But they made this funny little map here, and that led to a whole series of investigations of the cave for the next 150 years, where this becomes one of the touchstones for geologists trying to understand volcanic processes. Now they mention two different stories about the Outlaws, and one of them that they talk about in 1750 is clearly set in the 1490s, just before the Reformation. And this comes out in Hellismanna saga. Again, there are 18 outlaws. This is a recurring theme, always 18 outlaws. In this case, there are 18 young priestlings from Hólar who decide to get involved in black magic, and they travel through the interior of Iceland. They kidnap a series of girls, they rape them, they drown the babies in pools inside the cave, they raid the countryside around, and eventually are defeated by a very clever young man who lives in the nearby farm of Kalmanstunga. More outlaws, more and more outlaws. From this point onward, the story of outlaws becomes accentuated in the cave. So there is Hellismanna saga, that story about the evil priestly students was written down in the 1860s, and then about 1880, a man named Gisli Kolronsson put together another Hellismanna saga where he pulled together pieces from Landnámabók and from the earlier Hellismanna saga and created a story about Vikings living in Surtshellir. And that's the first time in 1880 when you get a direct discussion of outlaws living inside that cave as opposed to just in the areas around it. So anyway, by 1850 there are two stories about the cave and its cultural significance. One is that it's Surtur's home, the other is that it's an outlaw's base. And that's what we wanted to go back and take a look at. If it is Surtur's home, and if Thorvaldr Hólarki, or someone like him, or many people like him, had gone there to chant poems into the cave, is that telling us that there's something different going on here? Could it be a ritual site, a cult site? Could it be a place where outlaws lived? This is what it looks like as you go into as you come to the outside of it. There's a wonderful amphitheater-like space right in the, and I was thinking about exactly what you were talking about, a wonderful amphitheater-like space here where the ground is literally sunk and the walls all around it resound with your voice, and the cave is to go right down into that hole there. It's a 15-meter descent into the cave, and this is what it looks like inside there.
Wow.
It's important. This cave is 1.6 kilometers long, and after you get in about 120 meters or less, it is pitch black, solid black, no light at all. When you turn your lights off in a cave like that, you begin after about 3 minutes to think that you see light. And you think you see the way out. And if you follow that, you will die. You will fall over cliffs in this cave. You will bang into walls. You will break your leg or your ankle. This is an important aspect because as we think about people living inside a cave, almost 300 meters back into the cave, and not only 300 meters back into the cave, but to get to that little structure I showed you, you have to go 280 meters back into the cave, 5 meters up a sidewall, and back into another side cave. It's a difficult place to go. So what would you need to live? You need light. What would we expect to see archaeologically? Evidence of torches, lamps, soot, ash, fire starters. If people were living in there for a long time, we should see staining on the walls. Heat, hearths, soot, ash, fire starters. Again, you would need this. Water. You'd probably need water retention facilities. This is a dry cave. Although water comes through cracks in the ceiling now, when it was new, that probably was not happening. There are no streams. The closest stream is 7/10 of a kilometer across the lava field. You'd have to have a way to hold water if you had any group of people living there for a long time. Calls of nature. Didn't know what to say about, after dinner. But you would need latrine areas. You would have to find, in that darkness, you wouldn't be going a kilometer down the tube or out to the outside. And sadly, in a site like this, we could find what they left behind because the preservation is that good. So we'd expect to at least see phosphate-enriched zones, but possibly piles of night soils or whatever. For residential areas, we'd expect to see areas, if not with bedding, areas where bedding could have been put down. And around places where people had been sleeping, you'd expect to see them marked by evidence of heat and light and the loss of small objects in the dark. Food, cooking areas, we'd expect to see soot, ash. If there's 18 men living in here for a period of time, you should see a midden of fairly large proportions. You should see an ash deposit of significant extent. We should expect to see floral remains, etc. Material culture, an assemblage mirroring in some ways those of domestic or temporary occupation bases, and possibly, if it was a place where people lived, as in fact Halldór Laxness, the Nobel Prize winner, argued, he thought this wasn't a place where outlaws lived. He said this was a place where one of Iceland's first families lived, because coming into the cave after the eruption, it would be the only place which was geothermally warmed in Iceland. It would be a lovely place to live. You would expect to see, at any rate, some aspect of possibly gendered biases in the kinds of objects that were there. If it was instead a ritual site, we'd expect to see some of the things that we might see are that it is in a liminal position. It would be separated far away from the normal domestic sphere. We might expect to see special deposits, high value or rare objects, carefully placed, intact, or intentionally rearranged. Feasting debris, a very common aspect of Norse ritual activity, as we know from the sagas and we know from law codes and others. We'd expect to see, if this was a ritual place, possibly feasting debris, consumption of domestic fauna, especially the major taxa, prime animals. Esoteric control is another typical aspect of ritual sites, that is to say, the segregation of space, separating zones that are accessible to many from those that are accessible to just a few. And we heard about that a little bit earlier in Uppsala and others with the creation of processional ways. Structured space, potentially a formal layout of space and the segregation of activities and patterns not defined by efficiency or domestic function. And aggregation, the sense of people gathering here from potentially a number of different localities. So this is what Surtshellir looks. I don't quite know why the clouds are a little bit pink, but this is the size of the tunnels. This is us on top as in one of the places where the ceiling has collapsed. And that's another thing to think about Surtshellir. It's a dangerous place to work. The ceiling is always collapsing. And you're working under blocks that are held by a thread above your head. As we went in and did the work, what we found is that there are a number of archaeological features inside the cave. There are two galleries here. One is called Vigashetler, one is called Banehetler, the Bone Cave, and the Fortress Cave. These are names that were given by Egger Olofsson and Bjarni Paulsen in 1755. We don't think they have any older currency than that. And here there's a wall, and here is the structure inside. In 1755, Banehetler, the cave that's easier of access, was the one that they recognized as having all the bones. That's the one that they said was full of bones. The other one they said there's a pile of bones. You'll see that's a little different. But here, as the snow began to melt out of that opening, in 1999, 2000, 2001. There had been permanent snowdrifts in there as far back as anyone remembered. When we went in 2001, we found this feature here, which is a dry stone wall, 11 meters long, 4.5 meters, the top of it we can see now is 4.5 meters above the floor of the cave. Well over a man's height. The stones at the very top of it, this one here, is roughly 4,500 kilograms in weight. Massive things. This would have been raised in the dark, well above people's head height, totally sealing the cave. There's not a doorway through it, there's not a ladder way up through it. It was later, the ceiling has collapsed down over it, but we can see it going down as we pull rocks away from it. It is the largest dry stone construction from the Viking Age in Iceland. And it's enigmatic and very hard to date. As you go farther back in, as I say, you go about 280 meters back, 5 meters up a side cave, and about 20 meters back into the back, we hit this boat-shaped structure in the inside, built out of stone. It has 2 doors, one here, one there. It has what appeared to us to be a hearth at that end, until we realized, after having gone back there many years, that's tourists today. They're going and taking their torches, they're taking wood, and they're burning it in there. Every time we go back, there's new material around it. So this was a niche. There's a niche here, another niche here. Very formally laid out in a triangular format, all centered on the center of the cave. These are the tourists. This is the pile of bones. This is all that remained of it in 2010. We can see from staining on the wall and bone fragments that are in the wall, and comparing that to Egil Olaf's and Bjarni Paulsson's original description of it, that the bones originally went to here and covered an area about 4 meters in diameter. It's a massive pile of bones. And these are tourists walking through, German tourists walking through, and we went back in 2012 to do some mapping and to look for those features that we would expect to see if people lived here. What we found instead were beads coming out of the floor deposits that people had always thought were sterile. Very thin deposits with Viking Age beads appearing right on the surface. Because of that, we went back in 2013. We got permission from the Icelandic government, from Minjastofnun, to excavate all of the floor deposits there, because all it would take is one tourist looking down, seeing a bead, or us publishing what we knew about the site, and it would be gone in a day and a half, or even an hour and a half. So we carried the generator across the lava field, something I say I will never do again, and I say that every time. Again, these are the main parts of the cave. This is looking down through the cave. This is the area. So this is where the actual boat-shaped structure is here, or house, whatever you want to say. The walls are about 80 centimeters high. They appear never to have been any higher than that. There's no evidence of a roof structure. And besides, why would you create a house inside a cave, which is defined by walls and a ceiling and a floor? It's a really enigmatic structure. This is what it looked like as we began to excavate it. A very thin floor deposit here in the back, still intact. And as you peel it off, you see this crinkled skin-like surface of the lava down beneath. We divided everything into 50 by 50 centimeter squares, scooped out all the soil, mapped everything we could see, and then carried all of the dirt out of the place, back to Reykholt, dried it in place. We never should have done that. And then sorted it all through 1.5 millimeter mesh by hand over the course of a week, working like crazy. And that was really important because we found things that we never would have seen before, including a whole lot of these little beads that no one has ever reported from Iceland before, and many other things. So what did we find out in the cave? We surveyed the entire cave from one end to the other. We walked back and forth a couple of times. We find that there are no archaeological remains before that wall. There is no Viking activity that we can see anywhere beyond this space here, beyond the crossing, or beyond the boat-shaped structure here, although there is a lot of later early modern and modern contemporary debris from tourists and from geologists all the way back into the cave, so it's passable. But the Vikings didn't go any farther back than that location. We found no areas of soot, no other heating or lighting indicators except at the structure right over Vigishellir, right over that boat-shaped structure. There were no areas that we could find that were used as latrines. We were a little happy about that, but not really. No ash dumps, no middens, no evidence of big area of cooking, no water retention features, and no bedding or occupation areas, despite the location of at least 3 very, very, very large and easy to occupy places in immediate proximity to that. So if we had thought that boat-shaped structure, let's say, was their dining hall, and they wanted to come near there and live near it, there's nothing within walking distance of it. There's just no evidence for anyone ever living inside this cave. And that leaves a series of questions. And again, we get back to the lava having come down here. Another thing we'd have to think about if you were living there is exactly how hot can it be while you're living in there. We know sometime just after 871 AD, because it's flowed over that, it was 1200 to 1500 degrees centigrade. We as humans couldn't possibly survive in there until it was at least 50 degrees centigrade, more likely 40. For Northern Europeans, 35 would be pretty rough. As you get down below freezing, it gets to be a really difficult place to live. We're now working with a colleague at Brown University who's developed, I'll talk to anyone who wants to talk about this later, you just have to trust me on it, a technique that allows you to take animal bones from archaeological sites and by looking at particular bacterial residues on them to reconstruct the temperature at the time that the bone began to decay. It's a really cool new thing. And what we get when we compare 2 curves using 2 different methods of it is that we see that we get a cool down curve and that the cave goes below freezing by about 970 AD and never comes out of freezing until the modern period. We have dates from there at the end from 1954. It's great what you can do with radiocarbon dates after the atomic bomb. Woo! I didn't know that. So if you want to do modern stuff. But it means that if we go back to those stories of the outlaws that are in Landnama book, those outlaws are supposed to live there between 990 and 1015 or 1005. They would have been freezing their asses off. And the only way they could have survived there would be to have massive heating facilities to try to keep a 1.6 kilometer long lava tube warm. And we would see massive amounts of fire evidence in there. We just don't see it. So now I really don't think that there was anyone living there, but the cooling down process may instead have been very important for people thinking about what's going on inside the cave. Now I'm going to just go real quickly through some of the things that we find inside the cave. The largest thing by any amount, and this is what happens when you excavate a cave by 1.5 millimeter screening, is you find lots and lots and lots of fragments of the Firestarters, the matches in the pockets of the people who were in the caves. As you begin striking fire, they break off little blocks. Well, the cool thing is, it turns out you can tell where they came from. And this is something else we're working on right now. So the red Jasper Firestarter fragments, you notice they're all concentrated in the middle, and you may not be able to see in the back, but a group of them that have been fire scorched and blackened right here in the center gives us a clear sense that this is not where the fireplace was. The fireplace was right in the center of this structure. As we look at others, there are yellow jasper, they sort of encircle that area. Green jasper, again encircling it. White and beige, things that people thought might be southern Scandinavian flint, and I'm not sure about that yet. Again, circling that space. So we got a lot of these little pieces of Jasper Firestarter fragments. I know we've got one Jasper here. Jasper follows me everywhere. It's a problem for me. Not you. So what we do is we take that Jasper and we throw it on this funny little instrument here, which looks like a tricorder or a phaser. And what it does is it irradiates those Jasper fragments with X-rays and sends off information to us on the elemental composition of those Jasper or other fragments. It's called X-ray fluorescence, and it's a very, very nifty tool. As we begin doing that with the red Jasper fragments, again, the lines may be a little bit hard for you to see in the back, but they cluster into 8 separate groupings, geochemically different groupings, which suggests that they're from 8 different sources in different locations. We can match some of them up to a group to Jasper from Hestfjord in western Iceland. Another group down here to material from Kjalarnes, which we heard about the other day, not far from Reykjavik. None in the red ones from just in the area of Hvalfjörður, where the whaling station is, if you know. These are all within 50 to 75 kilometers of the cave. There's nothing from any of the sources closer to the cave. And there's material down here, 2 different groups, that the closest match we can get so far is to red jasper from eastern Iceland, from all the way over near Eilstaðir, almost 250 kilometers away. As we begin to look at the yellow jasper, again, you can break it into two major groups, and the green jasper into a separate location. The green all comes from one nice group. The yellow, two possible groups, possibly four groups, depending on how you look at the sub-clusterings of them. And these, again, come, we can see as we begin to look at the things. One group of them is certainly from Hestfjall, another group is from the Kjallarnes Esja region. Again, these same areas. So we get a sense of people coming to this place who've at least been in those locations, and the matches in their pocket are probably from the area near where they came from. The green we can't make any match to yet. We have green jasper right in Reykholtsdalur and Hvítárvíða, not far from this location, 30 kilometers away, but it's not that. We're still looking for that one. And the white material that was thought to maybe be Scandinavian flint, this is Scandinavian, southern Danish flint up here. It's all in a different area. It must be something else, and it's probably from another part of Iceland. We don't know exactly where. So if we map these on the landscape, the Egilsstaðir here, these are the ones that we know there are connections to. What we don't see there is that the closest material to the site is actually obsidian from right down the valley 5 miles away, right exactly where the Outlaws were supposed to have come from. We don't see any of the green from around Reykholt that we should see there. Again, it's giving us a sense that there is selectivity. There are things which are not being brought in, and there are things that are coming in from distances. And you can get a sense here of where this is going, that it's quite a number of different people coming in, most likely. It may be that these are 15 to 16 different fire starters in different people's pockets. It may be 15 or 16 different times that different people are starting fires in that place. But it's giving us a sense that this is not local people who have come in there just to make fires, as we'd expect if they were the local outlaws that are talked about before. And this just will move past that. In the center of the site, we found the most interesting pieces for most people, which is a set of lead weights. There's 4 of them. This is actually turns out to be a piece of solder. There are 4. They were found right in the center of the site. They're lead sitting right on top of where the hearths were created. There is one in the shape of a cross, which is probably the earliest Christian symbol in Iceland at this point. There's one which is a piece of a lead ingot, one which is a cone, one which is a cup. And the interesting thing is the measurement, the weights of them here. 13, 5.2, 5.2, and 2.6. When you put those together they weigh 26 grams, which is the unit of measure for the legal ounce in the old legal ounce system that Brugger and others had come up with, that was in use in Scandinavia from about the Merovingian period up until the 11th century. Parallel with another ounce unit, which is about 24 ounces, which was used for mercantile transactions. And that's the ounce, the euro, which is broken up into 3 ertogs, 8 grams each, more or less. This is a very different set here. And the interesting thing about it is it's unique in Iceland, and it's unique anywhere in the Viking world that I know so far. And what's even cooler is that when you take these 4 pieces and you put them together in combinations, they divide up the ounce into 10 units of equal measure. Now that's cool. Is that decimal? Is this like, before you got the decimal pound? I don't know. Decimal ounce. That would be perplexing if it weren't for the fact that there are 2 places in Grágás that describe the use of decimal unit ounces, broken into 10 ounces. One is in the chapter on the freeing of slaves, when you have to give silver in the amount of 1/10 of a gram using the old form of silver to manumit the slave and give him his freedom. The other is in Fjordvagsbalken, where you're talking about compensation, in which case it says that compensation for atonement of death, injuries, or debts has to be paid in silver weighed out in tenths of an ounce. In other words, the weight set that we found is not the usual one. It is a legal weight set for weighing out the value of human life, and would be only the sort of thing you'd expect to see in the hands of a chieftain or someone else who was involved directly in law. Now, it's important that this is made out of lead, and it's sitting right on top of the fire where they were cremating bone at 600 to 800 degrees centigrade, where lead would have melted. The fact that they survived means that these would have been placed there at the very last as they're leaving the cave. And it's probably because they're found within a meter of each other, an intentional deposit, probably a little bag that's been scuffed around by people. We also found beads all through the floor. In fact, we found beads that are more beads than any site in Iceland except for the chieftain's farm at Hrísbrú. And these, as we begin to go through them with XRF, indicate to us that they are probably coming, the ones up at the end, from Moravia, these ones from the Byzantine region, and these ones probably from southern Scandinavia. And then beside them we found what looked like flecks of gold, but turned out to be arsenic ore, orpiment, which comes from the borderlands of Turkey and Iran. This I know is orpiment. It works out really well geochemically. We found it in a number of places. And what's primarily used for in the Middle Ages is illuminations of manuscripts, the brightest yellow, the yellow on the Gokstad ship's shields, and also on the yelling man and other pieces of furniture from inside there. So to give a sense of Surtshellir way up there, the connections that are found just simply in this small assemblage span the entire Viking world, and they're almost all pieces which are found almost exclusively with elite practice. The bones, real quickly, bone pile. This is what the bones look like. They've been massively fragmented into tiny fragments. Tom McGovern did the analysis of them. They are all domesticates. Unlike what we'd expect to see for outlaws, there's no fish, there's no birds, there's nothing else. In addition to that, where he was able to get seasonality and age, it turns out that these are the animals in the prime of their life killed in the late winter, early spring. So exactly what you wouldn't expect to see in a normal assemblage in a site, but what you might expect to see for a big feast at the end of that period of time. And unlike any other Icelandic site, it is the only one which is all domesticates. And all of the pieces have been smashed into tiny fragments with hammers, axes, and large knives or swords, suggesting that these are animals which have probably been sacrificed and butchered roughly. But also because they're deep in a cave, it means for this to have happened, the animals couldn't have come down into the cave because it's a 15-meter drop in and you can't get a live animal up. So these animals had to have been killed outside the cave, dismembered, defleshed, the bones brought together, fragmented, and put in here. It's a very intentional deposition. There are more bones in Banehetler, and we'll just go quickly. In fact, it turns out not just here where we thought, but there are 8 piles of bones that actually create a barrier across the cave on the inside. And they seem to be, they're very intentionally placed. There's no hearths, no cooking areas anywhere else. So it's a very, very important structure. So I think when we get down to thinking about, is it a place where outlaws lived or is it a place of ritual, we really come down closer on the side that this is a place of cult activity. And a number of the things that we saw earlier today, if we think about how those animals would have had to get there, you would have had to have processions of people bringing these animals up through the valley bottoms. They would go past, by the only way here, all of the places in the stories of the outlaws where the chieftains who are referenced in them lived, past the place where the outlaws are said to have come, into the cave, into the outside where they're dispatched. You're almost certainly having either large piles of meat out there being left to rot, or people feasting at the same time on these, and then the animal bones being taken into the cave, where a very small portion of them are cremated and thrown deeper into the cave. And that's the only thing we see going deeper beyond that. I could go on for another half hour, but I know you have other things to talk about. And I just wanted to, I will be happy to debate with anyone, whether this should be outlaws or whether it's something else. But thank you for your attention, and I look forward to it.
Thank you. That is fantastic talk.